You know, I don't know if we're desensitized, but there's something, you know, when the president's press secretary tries to spin, I guess that's one thing. Little chilling to see the head of the Department of Homeland Security lying about how people infiltrate this country or come in, literally lying for this president. The president of the United States also got this wrong.
Just remember human traffickers. Remember drugs. The drugs are pouring into this country. They don't go through the ports of entry.
Yes, they do. And the president's own drug fighting agency says so. According to the Associated Press, and the DEA said in a November report that the most common trafficking technique by transnational gangs is to hide drugs in passenger vehicles or tractor trailers as they drive into the U.S. through entry ports.
So, Philip Rucker, we've talked about, again, how the president's campaign was based on a lie, a trick, so he would remember to bring it up at campaign rallies, how his campaign was based on the lie, how this shutdown is based on the lie. What is next, though, for a Republican Party who's now the Trump Republican Party, which used to be about smaller government, balanced budgets, NATO, a strong defense against Russian and Chinese aggression. Now you see the minority leader standing there next to the president in the Rose Garden, being part of this caravan of lies. And that's actually become the basis of Abraham Lincoln's grand old party. How does that party win another election in the foreseeable future?
Well, Joe, the continued lying, the continuing of sort of creating this false narrative, creating this false reality around so many issues, we've seen it throughout the presidency. It hurts the credibility of the administration and of the Republican Party when they're trying to negotiate through a very real crisis, which this government shutdown is. The government is not open and fully functioning as it needs to be, and there's an inability for the administration to negotiate fairly on a common set of facts with Democrats in Congress. The other day, Speaker Pelosi had that briefing along with the other congressional leaders, and she had to interrupt Secretary Nielsen as she was presenting information about the border because she did not believe that the information coming from the Department of Homeland Security was accurate or credible. And so the lack of credibility in the administration, in the data points that the federal government is sharing on behalf of President Trump, is creating a real problem for the Republican Party in solving any kind of solution that can get this government back open.
The president also said this about people in caravans from Central America who present themselves at the southern border.
They can apply for asylum, and they can, most importantly, they can apply for citizenship.
Oh, my God.
No,
his statement shows how little...
How he is ignorant about just about everything that has to do with the federal government. According to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, you have to wait a year after you've been granted asylum to apply for permanent residency, a green card. After that, you must be a green card holder for at least 5 years to apply.
I'm not sure he cares
for
about
citizenship. No,
facts.
There is a great video going around this weekend from a news site about Donald Trump saying, I know more about X than anybody. I know more about Y than anybody. Mika, time and time again, he knows less about, and this is his signature issue, he knows less about his signature issue than anybody out there on the stage, except for some people who still support him.
I don't understand, though, how he can get high-level cabinet members around him to lie for him. That part is chilling to me. Trying to justify the last 2 years, President Trump said this.
We've already built a lot of the wall. We've been working very, very hard.
Only he hasn't.
No.
The AP says Trump's claim is only supported when counting work done under past presidents.
So he's talking about the Obama wall.
And the fact that fences from prior administrations are not towering walls, he promised. He has, however, renovated some of the existing barrier. What he was really renovating was his signature campaign promise.
I said I was going to build a wall. I never said, I'm going to build a concrete. I said I'm going to build a wall.
Here he is saying exactly that.
What are the walls going to be made out of?
I'll tell you what it's going to be made of. It's going to be made of hardened concrete.
It's concrete plank. It's precast.
Concrete plank. You have to be kidding.
In fact, just last week, the president wrote on Twitter, an all-concrete wall was never abandoned. Yeah.
Well, so John Heilemann, we could keep going for 3 hours.
We could literally keep going all day.
Showing these lies. Though, again, we know Donald Trump's a liar, and we've known he's been a liar, and we know that he's lied about immigration. We know he's lied about the wall. We know he's lied about all of the statistics. We know he's ignorant about how people become citizens. Yeah. We know all of that. Yeah. I ask again the same question after the historic rout of Republicans in November as I asked before the historic rout of Republicans in November. And that is, why does this party continue marching over the cliff like lemmings behind a guy whose approval rating is about 40% on an issue where 75% of Americans oppose the president? 75% of Americans don't want the government shut down for his so-called phony wall. What comes next? At what point does Mitch McConnell say, hey, you know what? Maybe we don't want to lose 10 Senate seats in 2020. Maybe I don't want to have to retire in 2022 early because I don't want to be minority leader for the rest of my life. Right. When does that happen, John? It's got to happen soon, or this Republican Party is reduced to dust.
Right. Well, let's be clear. I think the question you're asking illustrates the fact that the Republican Party at the intellectual, moral level has already been reduced to dust. It's not a question of whether it will be. It already has been. And this question that you have been asking, we've been talking about now for, at least the last year or so, illustrates exactly the point. The party is, the reason that they continue to follow Donald Trump is very simple. It's really straightforward. It's fear. And the fear is the fact that they believe that President Trump continues to dominate their party, that his approval ratings within the Republican Party are sufficiently high that if they were to deviate from his course, however suicidal it is in any given instance, is that they will pay a price within the party. Mitch McConnell is a good example. Mitch McConnell sits every day and worries about all the long-term things you're talking about. But in the short term, what Mitch McConnell worries about is getting primaried in 2020. What happens if Mitch McConnell turns against Donald Trump? Mitch McConnell wonders in a state like Kentucky, where Trump's approval rating among Republicans is north of 80%. That's Mitch McConnell's main concern. It's the concern of a lot of Republicans is they can see that Trump is driving them off the cliff, but they look at the short term and they fear not the general election in 2020, but they fear the potential that Trump and a Trump-backed candidate could primary them and beat them before they even got to November. Is that fear, panic, cowardice, stupidity? It's all those things, but it is the thing that I think has been the governing dynamic in Republican politics for the last year. When will it change? It will change when they start to look at the math, and the math changes enough that it costs them less to leave Trump than it costs them to stay with Trump in their judgment.
Well, I must say, if a Democrat had concocted that, well, actually, Donald Trump was a Democrat for most of his life. But if a Democrat, let's just say Donald Trump actually is a shrewd Democrat that wanted to destroy the Republican Party.
Perfect.
He could not have created a more effective political virus to tear through the GOP and rip it to shreds.
Sure.
And have people afraid to stand up and fight for the values, Elise Jordan, that the Republican Party always stood for. Our Republican Party, the reason I went to Washington to fight Democrats is because I believed in balanced budgets, less debt, a smaller government, a strong, unified defense against Russian aggression and against Chinese communist aggression. These were the basics that we all believed in, that held us all together. Now, I didn't even talk about free trade. Now, none of this is part of what the Republican Party stands for anymore. Donald Trump has undercut every single one of those first principles of the Republican Party. And now it's about fighting for a phony wall.
Well, it's just amazing to me how many truly big government Republicans there are in the party. And after, about 8 years or so during the Obama years of hearing about cutting the deficit, cutting the budget, cutting spending, you have Republicans who really just seem to not care at all about the ballooning deficit. I think that the turning point for Trump, John's talking about how his popularity somewhere like Kentucky is at over 80% with voters. The turning point is going to be if the economy really takes a nosedive. And if we go into a recession, you look at how things have been fairly steady, but Donald Trump's, the unpredictability is not helpful to the overall economy. And does it look like 2019 is going to be a year where Donald Trump is going to be a purveyor of steadier policies and is going to calm down his rhetoric when it comes to the Fed and other economic matters? I think that's doubtful. And so I think that the economy goes, a lot of those Republicans finally go too, because plenty of Republican voters will forgive Donald Trump for pretty much anything as long as the economy's doing well. But when the economy goes, so they go.
But Mika, I don't understand why, because they are following the biggest spending Republican, the biggest spending liberal in the history of this republic. The budget is bigger than it has ever been under any Democratic president. The national debt is bigger than it has been under any Democratic president. And it just keeps exploding by the day. These are not big government Republicans in Donald Trump's party. They're what we would have called big government liberals not so many years ago. And the question is, why are all of these Republicans?
What are they doing?
Why are they supporting big government liberals who call themselves Republicans?
They're under a spell. I don't know. It seems certain that President Trump is going to break his half-baked promise to build a wall on the southern border, paid for by Mexico. But here's yet another outlandish campaign promise he's already broken. Remember during the campaign how often Donald Trump said that he was a master negotiator, that he alone could break the logjams in Washington, that he alone could do what career politicians could never do. He could do it. This morning, most of the government of Washington, Madison, and Hamilton is closed from the American people. Hundreds of thousands of people are working without pay. Others are in danger of losing their tax rebates, their housing, even the support they need to put food on the table for their children. And yet this president has skipped many of the key negotiating sessions. And when he's been present, not a thing gets done. He insults his guests. He goes on profanity-laced tirades, obsesses about impeachment. Master negotiator? Ask the many Americans whose families are desperate for this shutdown to end what they think of Donald Trump's negotiating skills. Not much, I'd guess. Not much at all.
Still ahead on more. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.